Have you wondered what it's like going to observe a wild horse roundup and what goes on there? Then this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses, Wild Horse Roundups, The Abuse Must End is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. There are a lot of people talking about a roundup going on in Nevada right now. So my newest episode will be discussing what is a roundup and why they are bad for our wild horses. When the Bureau of Land Management decides that they are going to capture and remove horses from a herd management area, they schedule a roundup. If it is not deemed an emergency, then they have to comply with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and put their plan out for public comment before they begin rounding up the horses. You may have seen the word that the BLM uses is gather. They are very fond of euphemisms, and I suppose that gather sounds gentler than roundup. But there is nothing gentle about a roundup. I will be discussing helicopter roundups today, which are called drive trapping, yet another euphemism. There is drive trapping and there is bait trapping. Bait trapping is different. They don't use a helicopter. They put bait inside pens and open the gates, and then when the horses go in and try to eat the goodies that are inside, they close the gate and then they select the horses that they are going to remove. This is a much less invasive procedure. But today we're talking about helicopter roundups, which is very, very different. The BLM says foaling season for wild horses is from March 1 to July 1, and during that time, no helicopter roundups are allowed. Yet many, many foals are being born in July, August, and September. Young foals should never be subject to a helicopter roundup because they could be run for up to 10 miles. The premise that a helicopter roundup is based on is using a helicopter to scare wild horses into running into a trap. Wild horses are prey animals. They have the instinct to flee when frightened. The helicopter pilot finds a group of horses and chases them until they go into the trap. If they frighten the horses too much, they will scatter. So the pilot needs to be able to keep the horses moving in the direction he wants, but not too fast. Horses will instinctually group up together, so it is in the pilot's best interest to keep up a steady pace, but not a fast pace. The contractor, who's been hired by the Bureau of Land Management to conduct the roundup, will have set up the trap and a long line of T-posts covered with jute to guide the horses into the trap. Once the horses get near the trap, the contractor lets a horse go who has been trained to lead the horses into the trap. Horses naturally follow other horses. This horse is called the Judas horse for obvious reasons. Once the horses go into the trap, with the helicopter low and persistent behind them, the gate is shut and the horses will be sorted and separated by stallions together, mares together, and foals together. It sounds simple, but so many things can and do go wrong. And how well the contractor has prepared and how much they care about the horses' well-being will make a big difference in how the horses are treated and how many injuries and deaths occur. Wild horses are just that, wild. And as such, they are unpredictable and can panic easily. They are exquisitely sensitive as well, and harsh treatment can result in severe injuries. My first taste of how badly a roundup can go wrong was in 2008 at the Sandwash Basin Roundup in Colorado. I went on the first day that was advertised to the public to observe. The media had already had one day of observation. Members of the public were told to meet the BLM staff at a particular time near the corrals which were not far from the main entrance to the herd management area. The old wooden pens held horses that had been captured the day before, including one of the most beautiful, angry horses I had ever seen. A tricolored pinto, I was told, was named Picasso. They had aged him at 20 years old, which is quite old for a wild horse. He was being held until the end of the roundup, when he and some other horses would be released. He was clearly very unhappy about going through this again and losing his family. We were told we could stand in a particular area, not too close to the trap, but we did have a view of the horses being driven by the helicopter into the trap. We saw wide eyes and some horses trying to evade the helicopter, but did not see any injuries or problems. That all changed the next day when they set up a trap in a different part of the herd management area. The next morning, we drove to the new trap following a BLM employee. We were told where to stand out of the way behind bushes and trees, and we had a good view of the trap. There was a very narrow passage that the horses would have to be driven into after entering the very small corral that was the trap. And it seemed scary to me even before the horses began coming in. There was a horse trailer that the small, narrow passage led into. There was trouble with the very first group that entered the trap. Instead of letting the horses settle down and rest for a bit and calm themselves after their run-in, the contractors began waving flags and trying to scare the horses into running down the narrow passage to the horse trailer right away. My concerns were justified when I saw a horse in front panic, try to turn around, and be slammed into the panels by the horses behind him. It was a horrible sight. He went down, but he was able to get up. I watched horses flip over, running into panels over and over again. I kept hoping they would figure out what they were doing was wrong, and I spoke to the BLM staff person there several times, and he said he would talk to the lead BLM person, but nothing was done. Nothing was changed. The climax of this terrible day was when a gray mare tried to get away, flipped over, and was trampled by the horses behind her, who were panicked into running by the wranglers driving them into the trailer. I was horrified, my hands over my face, barely able to watch. I was sure that she would be terribly injured. She was finally able to stand up, covered with dirt, and then she too was driven into the trailer. I was sickened and angry and talked to the BLM staff as I walked back to my car. They told me that 11 horses had died during this roundup. Given it only went on for 3 days, that was a lot of dead horses. I found out the name of the contractor who was doing this roundup. It was Cook, and they had a reputation for being rough with the horses and for having a lot of deaths. But there is something very important that we all must keep in mind. The BLM hires these contractors, pays them millions and millions of dollars to conduct these roundups, and it is the BLM's responsibility to manage the contractors and to protect the welfare of the wild horses that are in their care. The BLM staff at this roundup should have stopped the contractors when they saw there was a problem and made them reconfigure the trap and change how they were trapping and loading the horses. Their negligence caused these deaths. When I returned home, I contacted Henry Bisson, who was the deputy director of the BLM. I had met him at a Wild Horse Advocates meeting, and my experience of him that he was a decent person who cared about the horses. I sent him photographs of what had happened and asked him to do something so this would not happen again. To my chagrin, I received a reply from a staff person who tried to make excuses, explain away, and minimize the problem. Unfortunately, this would become the pattern for all of my contacts with the BLM from that point onward. I assembled a slideshow set to music of the whole catastrophe and put it on YouTube, and the link is on the podcast website. When there are injuries and issues at a roundup, you may hear people talking about COP. Well, what is it, and how does that pertain to rounding up wild horses? COP is the Bureau of Land Management's comprehensive animal welfare program. On their website, it says it's a proactive program for protecting the welfare of wild horses and burros under the agency's management and protection. The BLM is committed to protecting animal welfare and providing humane care and treatment to all wild horses and burros protected by the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act. The COP formalizes standard operating procedures surrounding animal care and handling, establishes formal training programs in animal welfare for BLM personnel, partners, and contractors, and implements internal and external assessments for all activities undertaken in the Wild Horse and Burro program. I will have a link on the podcast website so that you can read the entire document. Sounds good, doesn't it? Well, the problem is, this program and the guidelines are self-reviewed. There are no consequences for noncompliance. It is the BLM's own guidelines, which they wrote and they document. So if the horses suffer from violations of these guidelines, which I see often, there is no recourse. On the section about gathers, very first on the list is that horses must not be pursued to the point of exhaustion. But so many times I have seen horses lathered up, heads down, barely able to trot, being pushed to the trap. I see them roped and pulled into the trap. They are not supposed to push a group faster than the weakest member can keep up, and yet so many foals are left behind because the contractor is rushing these horses. Compliance with the guidelines needs to be mandatory, not optional. An outside agency needs to review what is being done, how the horses are treated at the roundups, and there needs to be enforceable consequences for noncompliance. Our wild horses need to be protected from the very agency that is supposed to be managing and caring for them. I have attended 14 roundups since 2005, and the ability of the public to observe what is happening changed drastically in 2010. I went to Wyoming to observe the Adobe Town Roundup in October 2010. When I arrived at the meeting spot, there were 4 BLM public information staff and 4 rangers armed with guns. They led us out to an observation site at an oil drilling pad that was so far away from the trap that we could not see it or the path leading up to it. We could only see the helicopter driving the horses on the way. This was a huge change. Now, the BLM had clearly decided that the way to avoid outcry against cruelty to the horses was just to not allow anyone close enough to see, video, or photograph anything that might go wrong. And this philosophy goes on to this day. I have been placed 1.5 miles to 2.5 miles away from traps, usually with a hill or other landscape feature blocking my view. To answer the question, what is it like to attend a roundup? I'll go over my experiences, which have been in Colorado and Wyoming. It is very difficult to just sum up the experience, but I'll do my best. Anyone can attend a roundup. There is no special permission required. First, you have to find out the dates that the roundup will be conducted. Usually contacting the field office in charge of the area is the best way, and ask them to let you sign up for email information. They will direct you to the correct person. Sometimes we only get a few days' notice of when the roundup will begin, and that can change as the contractor's schedule changes. Then the public information staff person will send an email to interested parties, which includes when and where to meet. Everyone has to drive their own vehicle, and 4-wheel drive really is a must in the herd management areas. Once we meet, usually very early in the morning, we wait until the contractor gives the go-ahead to drive to our observation location. Once we arrive, the BLM tells us exactly where to park and where to stand to observe. This location has been mapped out in advance by the BLM lead for the roundup. We are not allowed to leave the site without permission, and not allowed to go outside of the area we've been assigned. We have to bring our own food, water, chairs, and anything else we might need over a long day. There are no bathrooms. And then it is a matter of waiting for the ominous drone of the helicopters as they fly out, then waiting for them to bring in groups of horses. I try to count the horses coming in as I photograph, but I'm not good at that, so I usually rely on someone else for approximate numbers. In Wyoming, there are usually not many members of the public who attend, so I'm often the only one, just me and the BLM staff member assigned to manage me for the day. I have seen helicopters chasing horses for hours. I have seen foals roped and flipped over. I've seen a mare collapse and be dragged into the trap with a rope. I've seen horses charge through lines of jute and escape. And I've seen single horses chased for an hour. I have seen horses pushed through a barbed wire fence. I have been out in 10 degrees in the winter trying to keep warm, running back to my car to warm up when each group finishes going into the trap. I have almost passed out from heat stroke after climbing a steep hill in 95-degree heat to get to the observation point. I once almost stepped on a rattlesnake when heading to my car. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's very important for members of the public to be there observing, and for members of the public who care about our wild horses. I have also been screamed at and threatened by ranchers. I firmly believe that they will treat the horses with more care if someone is watching. Usually at the end of the day, they will allow us to go to the temporary holding pens where the horses are brought and counted. There is usually a wait. The longest wait I had was 4 hours. And then they had shipped most of the horses out before they let us in. They will show us the horses that are at the temporary holding area, but usually in a big rush, making us walk fast, and it's hard to assess the condition of the horses through the dark black mesh in and around the pens. During the checkerboard roundup in Wyoming in 2021 to 2022, they put thick jute around the pens so that all you could see, if you're short like me, are ears and parts of heads. I was allowed to bring a stepladder on 2 days so I could see into the pens. The BLM lead usually gives the tour of the pens and reports how many injuries and deaths there have been that day, how many were captured, and we do have a chance to ask questions, which is the most valuable part of being there. I ask about the foals. Did they get reunited with their mothers? I ask about the horses that looked bad when they were being brought in or had difficulty. And I don't always get answers at the time, but I usually at least get the response that they will get back to me about it, and they usually do. All this information is not available on the online BLM gather reports, and it is important that members of the public know this information about their wild horses. The roundup that is going on now in Nevada in the Antelope Complex has been the most horrific in memory. 31 horses have died so far. Broken necks, broken legs, dehydrated foals, abandoned foals, a mare dragged by her neck, and worst of all, the Palomino stallion who snapped his leg, escaping from the pen, who ran for over 30 minutes before wranglers caught and shot him. There are many more deaths that occur in the holding facilities that are not reported as roundup deaths. Yes, these injuries and deaths and abuse happen all the time at roundups, but not usually so visibly, and not so many horrible injuries and deaths all at one roundup. And it is because observers are there that we know about this. I'm posting a link to Wild Horse Education's blog, where Laura Lee does a tremendous job reporting on what is going on at that roundup and about their lawsuit to stop the madness that is this roundup. It is a devastating experience observing a roundup, especially when I'm watching horses that I know and have spent time with being driven into the trap. I know they will never see their family again. They will never see the land that they were born on and know so well again. They will be taken to a holding facility, which may be full of disease. They may be offered for adoption, or they may not be. They won't have shade or shelter, and they may not get enough food. They may die there. This is abuse, plain and simple, and it needs to stop. The BLM needs to stop torturing our wild horses and start humanely managing them on the range, in their homes, with their families, where they belong. The Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act, H.R. 3656, was introduced by Representatives Dina Titus, David Schweigert, and Steve Cohen. This act is to end cruel helicopter roundups once and for all. You can ask your representatives to co-sponsor this bill. I have a link you can go to on my website in the podcast, and please contact your representatives. America's wild horses deserve better. We can do better. And the fight to protect them continues. Thank you for listening to episode 14 of Freedom for Wild Horses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.